In this next mini lecture, we're going to talk about Article 2 of the Constitution, which has to do with the executive. Now, of course, this was very important to the founders because there was a fear that a strong executive would create havoc, would take over. And so the idea was, how do we have an executive that's strong enough to enforce the laws that Congress makes, but also accountable enough that they can't tyrannize? And so Article 2 is what was come up with. And the decision really was that the executive was going to be chosen by representatives of the states. Now, this has changed a little bit, but not as much as one would think. The executive branch includes a number of people. We are going to focus on the president because that's usually the focus of discussion of the executive, but the vice president is part of the executive branch, as is the cabinet, the bureaucracy, the State Department, the National Security Agency, the post office. All of these areas are part of the executive branch because they are responsible for carrying out the laws that Congress makes. Now, the president is elected every 4 years. So not the long terms of the senators, but not the short terms of the representatives. And the idea was that the president would be elected by an electoral college, which would include representation from the states. Now, to start off with, the electoral college includes each state having votes equal to the number of senators plus the number of representatives. So, looking at the examples we looked at last time, we'll see that Colorado has 2 senators and 7 representatives, and so Colorado has 9 electoral votes. Montana, a smaller state, still has 2 senators and 1 representative and has 3 electoral votes. California, our biggest state, has 2 senators and 53 representatives, and so California has 55 electoral votes. Now, this is still a balance between the interests of large states and the interests of small states, because even though people are going to focus more on California because California has so many electoral votes, Montana proportionally actually has more per person because of the 2 senators. And so, again, it represents a balance between those 2 perspectives. So once we understand how many people are in the Electoral College, we should note that the Constitution says that the Electoral College members are chosen by a method determined by state legislatures. So each state legislature is responsible for determining how the members of the Electoral College are chosen. Now, over time, what's happened is almost every state legislature has determined that the winner of the popular vote in that state will get all of the electoral votes. Okay, so there's a slate of electors that are pledged to each candidate, and whichever candidate wins, those electors become part of the Electoral College. So in Colorado, we'll have 9 electors, and when we vote, we're still voting for president. So let's say Hillary Clinton runs against Rand Paul. If Rand Paul wins with 51% of the vote, because of the rules, those electors that are pledged to Rand Paul would win. And so it's winner take all. So all of those electoral votes would go to the winner of Colorado's presidential contest. Now, there are exceptions. Maine and Nebraska do it a little bit differently, where they allocate votes by congressional district. But for the most part, every state is winner take all. So you could win that state by 1 vote and get all of the electoral votes. The other thing to note is that the winning candidate must get a majority of the electoral votes. For the most part, that's pretty much no-brainer because we have 2 main political parties, and we haven't really had a situation recently anyway in which there was a major third-party candidate who could get a significant number of electoral votes. The controversy usually is that it's possible to get a majority of the electoral votes without a majority of the popular vote, which we saw happen most recently in the year 2000. But if something happens and nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, what happens, and this is the 12th Amendment, so it actually started in the early 1800s, is that it would go to the House of Representatives. with each delegation getting 1 vote. So Colorado, if let's say there's 3 candidates and none of them gets the 270 votes necessary to win, it would go to Congress. And particularly the House of Representatives in Congress, and each House delegation would get 1 vote. So it goes to Colorado, and let's say one candidate gets 4 votes of the Colorado delegation, and another candidate gets 3 of the 7 votes. The Colorado delegation's entire 1 vote would go to the winner of that vote. All right, so there'd be 50 votes possible in that particular case. Again, that's never happened because we haven't had a case actually since, actually it has happened. It happened in 1824. But since 1824, we haven't had a situation where it's gone to the House of Representatives. Currently, there are 538 electoral votes, 1 for each of the 435 representatives, plus 1 for each of the 100 senators. The other 3 electoral votes are because a later amendment gave the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., 3 electoral votes as well. So 270 electoral votes are needed to win the presidential election, or at least win the Electoral College to win the presidential election. So we do vote for president, but that vote is mediated through electoral votes that are determined by the Electoral College. It's a little bit tricky, but it's a really interesting system, especially to see how it's evolved from something that was supposed to represent the states to something that involves something more popularly elected. Now, in terms of the president's powers, the actual enumerated powers are fairly simple, but they're important. One is the president is commander-in-chief. Now, if you remember from Congress, Congress also has powers in regard to funding the military, raising the military, and things like that. And so at times, the president's role as commander-in-chief and the foreign policy power that it gives the president does conflict with what Congress does. And so we'll find institutional conflicts between the president and Congress in these areas, which is one of the checks and balances each has over each other. The president also has the ability to pardon, which is a check that the president has on the courts. And another check that the president has on Congress is that the president can veto legislation. If both houses of Congress pass a bill and the president doesn't like it, the president can veto that. And the veto can be overridden if 2/3 of each house, 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House of Representatives vote to override. And so this is an important check that the president has on Congress. But again, if Congress overwhelmingly supports that bill, the Congress can override the president's veto. Now, the president also has things that the president can do with the advice and consent of the Senate. One is make treaties. As you know, a lot of what the president does is engage with foreign leaders, and in many cases that involves making treaties. If the president signs a treaty, it still has to be ratified by the Senate, and that takes 2/3 of a vote. Appoint ambassadors. Again, ambassadors to different countries are appointed by the president, but the Senate needs to support that. And also, justices to the Supreme Court are appointed by the president with advice and consent of the Senate. And we'll talk more about the Supreme Court later. So these are also important powers of the president. And you can see where all of this is taken together. The president has quite a bit of influence, because the president can influence legislation merely by saying what's acceptable and not acceptable in terms of getting a veto. The president can initiate treaties. The president controls the armed forces, although I should be careful there because there are laws that control the armed forces as well. But the president has never, had the ability to use the armed forces at will. The president has a great deal to say about foreign policy, although again, Congress has something to say about that as well. The other constitutional mandate that the president has is the State of the Union. The president can or must actually every year deliver to Congress a statement on the State of the Union. Originally, the State of the Union was something that was just delivered to Congress. It was a letter. But over time, it's become an important way for the president really to review what's going on in the year and give Congress a sense of what the president's agenda is. And also, especially in the age of television and other forms of media, the president can address the people directly under the guise of addressing the Congress. And one check that the Congress has on the president is that the president can be removed from office by Congress. This is the impeachment process. Now, in order to be impeached, the House of Representatives has to vote to impeach the president. That has actually happened quite rarely. Andrew Johnson was impeached. Bill Clinton was impeached. There was talk that Nixon would be impeached when he resigned in 1974. And so it really doesn't happen very often. And once the president is impeached, there's a trial in which the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sits as sort of the moderator, and the Senate acts as jury. And it takes 2/3 of the Senate to vote to convict for impeachment. Johnson escaped by 1 vote, and of course Bill Clinton did not get convicted as well. So no president has actually been impeached and then convicted. The Constitution says that the president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And it's that language, other high crimes and misdemeanors, that has been quite controversial. Is perjuring yourself, for example, regarding your affair with an intern, does that count as a high crime and misdemeanor? Obviously, in Clinton's case, the Congress said yes, it did. Clinton did not believe that it was that serious. In any case, this is a major check that Congress has on the president. Now, there isn't a lot of space about the vice president, and it's because the vice president really doesn't do much unless the president asks the vice president to do more. The vice president is also elected by the Electoral College. Initially, the vice president was the person who finished second in the election by the Electoral College. But over time, actually, because of amendments to the Constitution, the vice president is now elected separately. And of course, the president and vice president generally run as a ticket now. And so whatever political party wins the presidential election, those delegates also go to the vice president. And so the vice president is elected as the person the president has chosen, or the president's party has chosen for the president to run with. The vice president's main jobs are 2. One is the vice president takes over as president if the president cannot finish serving the term. Now, over time, there have been amendments that have refined what this means. Generally, as a matter of fact, in almost every case, it has been death, although there are cases, there was one case of resignation when President Ford took over for Richard Nixon when he resigned. But there are cases where if the president is incapacitated for some reason, the vice president can take over. And importantly, the vice president is also the president of the Senate. So if there are ties, the vice president can actually vote to break a tie, which can be really important at times when you have close legislation. And so the vice president doesn't really do a lot, but at times the vice president's role can be very significant. And this is the basics then of the executive. Next, we will turn to the role of the judiciary.